Hi, and welcome to FRL, the Fragility podcast. Together with our guests, we explore how the forces of fragility manifest across the world and in our day-to-day lives, and how we can build a more resilient future. I'm Mihaela Karstey, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Paul Biska and Johan Burman Bergman. And today, we are delighted to be joined by Dina Saleh. Dina is the Regional Director of the Near East, North Africa, and Europe Division at the International Fund for Agriculture, IFAD, the only specialized global development institution exclusively focused on rural transformation. Before that, she was based in Cairo, leading IFAD's Middle East and North Africa hub as sub-regional director. Dina has more than 20 years of international experience in development projects and programs in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. Prior to joining IFAD, Dina worked at the United Nations Office for Project Services in Nairobi, in Tunis, in Rome, and with private sector companies. Dina, welcome to F-World.
Hi, thank you.
So first, we always love to learn about our guests, your story. How did you become interested in agriculture where you are today? Why did you choose to study business? What are some of those milestones along your path that brought you to where you are today?
Well, Mihaela, it's actually been quite as I like to tend to think, it's a long journey, but actually short life. So, I was born in Yemen and I grew up in Kenya to a business family that was involved in a lot of agricultural trade. So that would be my first introduction. When I was 4, I lived on a farm in Kenya. So grew up with animals all around me and nature. And I think a lot of those attributes and just my environment conditioned a little bit how I got interested in this. But a funny fact is that while I was in school in Kenya, they made it mandatory that agriculture should be one of the subjects for primary education. And I hated that. I think it was just the fact that they made it mandatory. It was something that we grew up, knowing about. We would go visit farms, and the fact that somebody said, well, you're going to do exams on that, made us, sort of like resist the fact. But, it's something that was really very intrinsic to my formative years. It was something that I was very much aware of everywhere I went. And then the business side of the family, which was dealing a lot with hides and skins. So a lot of livestock was part of what really influenced my, I would say, natural path to working in agriculture and being a little bit business-minded, which is why I got into private sector in the first place.
So actually, I want to follow up on that. I think you're best placed to describe to us where food comes from, right? You've experienced it. A lot of us that have grown up in cities don't have that level of experience. And it's sometimes hard to get a good feel for where does food come from? And so before we move further, can you describe why, sort of from your experience growing up, what did you see about agriculture and investment in agriculture that was so important to poverty reduction?
So, maybe going, as you said, growing up in Kenya, I mean, most of the agriculture was subsistence farming. People grew a lot of what they ate in their own household, backyard gardens, having farms, maybe 1 hectare, 2 hectares wasn't something strange for your neighbor to have, so it was, every class seemed to have that sort of form of farming or that sort of, sort of source of food, which was either grown in, you had your patch garden or you had this large farm where you grew maize or you grew, you had your animals. There was mixed farming. So you had, you had your animals there, but you also had your some of your vegetables and some of your cereals as well. So for me, I think when I look back at all of that and how it, it made it kind of was natural to us that was the way people lived and the way people got their food. I must say that in those 20 years that I was growing up there, I did see a change. I did see small-sized farms becoming commercialized by big industries coming in, especially the cereals, and the dairy farming became, more privatized and commercialized. And in a very paradox way, people who could afford food initially, who were growing their own food, started having difficulty accessing food, because then the private companies became the source of food, and then you'd have to go to the supermarket or to the shops to buy your food. So what used to be very easy and free, I think with the economies and evolving and more, let's say, sophistication, more technologies, it made farming a bit more expensive.
Before we delve deeper into all of these topics, I wanted to ask you. You were born in Yemen, and obviously, fortunately, right now Yemen is in the news due to a conflict. And maybe we can preface a bit the further conversation about fragility and how it's like to work in these countries by you telling us a bit about what you think about the roots of this conflict, and is there, what would be a way out in 2 minutes?
Yeah, unfortunately, as you said, the situation in this whole region is currently in a very precarious situation. However, when I was born and the first few years, Yemen was one of the most peaceful places on earth. In fact, Yemen's is called the Arabian Felix, or it was the happy Arabia. So that was what Yemen used to be referred to, in Arabic we say Yemen is Sa'id. So it was a happy Yemen. And of course, I can't tell you what is the root of this problem. There are many factors, as we all know, and some of us speculate a lot. But I think when you do come to some of the essence of such countries, it's not something that happens overnight. It's fragility is something that occurs over time and erodes the community's capacity to resist or to be able to be more resilient to such shocks, right? Be it man-made shocks, or be it any climate shocks, or any of the shocks that people face. So I think when that happens over time, and institutions are then sort of incapacitated, and it's a lot of factors: education, health. So many of the essence of what we say basic essentials for human life are eroded. Then one small shock, or big shock, as we are seeing, can have a huge effect. So it wasn't 1 minute of answer, but I think it kind of summarizes some of the things that are happening in Yemen and the other parts of the region.
Indeed, a very eloquent summary of a very complex situation. You mentioned this transition in Kenya that you saw growing up from kind of subsistence farming into commercialized, maybe the development of cash crop farming. And I think recently, or maybe in the last decade or two, we've seen, a realization that, as you said, these farmers who turned to cash crops, etc., were actually being impoverished to some degree by these new systems, etc. So knowing that, having these lessons in mind, why is investing in agriculture the kind of the critical solution to poverty reduction? But more than that, how should we be investing in agriculture to help drive those outcomes that you do with the IFAD?
Right. So I think, everyone recognizes that investing in agriculture is, I think, one of the most important factors for driving economic growth. Maybe it was neglected for many years and under-resourced, but I think more and more we're realizing that investing in agriculture and growth in the agriculture sector now is like 2 to 4 times more effective in raising incomes among the poorest communities. So I think this is something that most of those of us involved in this sector and investing in this sector, I think, can recognize and have evidence of this. And then it's also contributes about 4% of global GDP. And in some of the least developed countries, it contributes about 25% of GDP. So with those kind of numbers, I think you can easily see that the impact of agriculture, and the, thinking about, like, there's about 3.8 billion people worldwide where, where food systems provide their livelihoods. And then you have also agriculture alone employing over 800 million people. So the role of the sector is very, very important. And I think from that point of view, the potential for the sector is also extremely high. And I know that, as you know, that the Food Systems, Summit, that was 2 years ago, and then actually 3 years ago now, and because we're already in 2024. But and last year's Food Systems Stocktake actually amplified the opportunities that the investing in the agriculture sector and how much potential. Because if you look at the food industry, it holds about, $12 trillion. And if you think about that, and this is just massive amounts of money that we can, that underscore the central role in global economies that the entire food systems plays. So I think thinking about it, I mean, agriculture is becoming more and more prominent. And I would really love to see the day where agriculture is one of the most resource sectors in any government's budget. Because I know in Africa, the Malabo Declaration wanted to see a lot more of investments in the agriculture sector. It's not happening. In many countries, it's less than 3%. So I think this is one call I would really like to see happening. So, yeah, and I hope I've covered your question.
Absolutely. And I actually want to, you mentioned the global stocktake, you mentioned the word food systems. And let's break down that concept. Can you help us imagine a food system? Sort of, some of us might have a better or worse image of it, but can you describe it for us? What are food systems? What are their building blocks?
Mm-hmm. So actually, maybe to simplify it for any, a layman or any one of us who just looking at it, it starts, people say, from farm to fork or farm to plate. I would normally say from the soil to the plate, and even goes beyond that, frankly speaking. And it's everything in between, because it starts with the production systems. It starts then with, harvesting, post-harvesting, transportation, disposal, the entire chain of whatever happens in the food sector is part of the food systems. So this is my understanding of it, and I think most of us look at it that way. And there are various actors. So it's like a little bit like you have a chain and you have various nodes of this chain, and everyone has a part to play in it.
I actually wanted to ask you, is IFAD doing anything? You said beyond the plate, on nutrition, on sort of what are the consequences of the food that we actually eat?
Yeah, and this has been a debate, I think, that has been on the table for quite some time about, you've heard of healthy diets, you've heard of nutrition, and initially, IFAD is taking this very seriously, and we have it as one of our core mainstreaming themes. So nutrition, we have 4 mainstreaming themes that we absolutely must factor into any of our investments, and one of them is nutrition. We have gender, we have climate, and we have youth. So they have to factor in somewhere. And nutrition, is perceived only as saying, well, it's about malnutrition. No, it's not about malnutrition, because you can also have obesity, and you can have also a question of what are the type of food that you're eating. Even if you look healthy, you might not be eating the right food. So So we're looking at that in terms of also education, making sure that for IFAD, communities are educated about nutrition, about diversifying also their food systems, making sure that, if you're only growing a certain staple, then maybe you should also have access to other types of foods. Also in schools, we're working also with other partners in school feeding programs to make sure that we also introduce that from an early age, and working with women, because women, as you know, play an important role in their homesteads and in their, in the kitchen to produce and also to present some sort of healthy, balanced diet. It reminds me actually when I was in school, but I wouldn't, go into too much on that. But when I was in school, again in Kenya, we had home economics as part of our education. And whenever you went for any of the breaks, and you would actually see that, they would make sure that you could see the fruit and you could see the vegetables and you could see the meat, and was well labeled. So, right from an early age, you started to realize that I need to have all these components of my meal rather than just, seeing chips, for example, or fries, as we call them.
So you've outlined just before the food system, sort of each node of the chain. Could you tell us a bit about what are some of the factors that make these systems resilient or more fragile?
So I think, most of these systems it could be because of climate. So one of the impact of this, if it's on the production systems, it could be fragile because of climate change, as we all realize. That has been one of the, I think, growing challenges to most of the producers. Another is investments in infrastructure, investments in technologies. We have less and less capacity to invest in proper infrastructures, either for market or even productive infrastructure, irrigation, which again, if you look at it in terms of, it's all linked as well to the climate factor. So if people are using a lot of water or are using less water, it can also impact on their food systems and their production. But also if they are working on markets and technologies, that kind of investment can also help educate, but also help to reduce the costs of production. So I think there are many factors that can also impact. But then there's also the other type. If you have conflict, if you have, if you have instability, if you have migration, these are all impacting also on food systems. Because again, if you have area of conflict, you probably have less opportunities, for markets to function properly. Yeah. So these are just some of the ideas that I have in terms of fragility in food systems.
And so from where you're sitting in terms of investing in agriculture, what are the key trends that you think are driving not just IFADs, but kind of global investments in the agriculture space that we should be keeping an eye on?
So the key trends, again, go back to climate. Climate, I think, is a big one. And we're seeing more and more of the impact of climate change. I also think that another trend, and unfortunately, is conflict. Increasing conflicts around the world are also impacting, be they localized conflict or also regional or global conflicts are having a huge impact. Inflation is another trend. Food inflation is also a major area for concern, but also to watch out for, because you see countries that are middle income countries that are high up on the list of food inflation, and even oil producing countries are facing this. So it makes you wonder then what are the dynamics that are happening as well in terms of creating these worrying trends. I know that again, water scarcity, again linked to climate, is a big issue. So here are some of the patterns that I think we're keeping an eye on, even in IFAD. This is why climate is a big area for us to ensure that climate adaptation is something that we have been really advocating for very strongly.
So we keep mentioning IFAD, and I sort of described it as a very unique institution, right, in my introduction. But can you help us better understand, paint the picture of what IFAD is and what does it do, and what does its unique status enable it to do differently?
So, so let me start with its name. It's the International Fund for Agriculture Development. And IFAD was actually, the genesis of IFAD was during the world food crisis that was being faced in the early 70s. When there was the oil price shock. So very similar conditions to what we're facing today was when there was a group, and actually mostly the OECD and OPEC countries that sat together and decided to create this institution that was specially focused on investments in agriculture. So for IFAD, it's been now almost a 50-year journey for us to also, like any institution, there's been an evolution of the institution. We have also been, like I said, we have these mainstreaming themes, but this has also been compounded by and becoming more prominent for us as a financier, is to focus on these areas because these are the emerging themes and emerging priorities globally. One other thing that on IFAD's side is that, for those who are not aware, IFAD actually became a credit-rated institution. Almost now, it's going to 2 years. And that has given us the notion or the business model and modus operandi changing from just being a UN specialized agency and an IFI to really becoming more of an IFI and becoming more of a bank in terms of investment. So we have actually been also moving more towards being an investor that has to make sure that we have safeguards. We have also to ensure that we are putting our money where I would say where the global issues are most prominent. So Africa, for example, is becoming our 60% of our resources go to Africa. And then a minimum of 30% of our resources going to fragile situations. So, and then of course, there's a big component of all of this, which is within that, which is climate, right? So climate factor is a huge component of where we invest, and value chains. So we have more than 75% of our investments have been in value chains. Again, this is part of our food system. So we are making sure that we actually address the full chain of the food system, to be able also to address many of the challenges that are facing food security today.
And can you give us an example of, let's say, an IFAD project? How does it happen from, let's say, from genesis to impact?
Well, okay. So let me take an example of a country which is fragile. So then we can kill two birds with one stone. So we have been investing in many fragile countries, but Somalia comes to mind. So we had actually been working with Somalia since the 90s. Actually, even the late 80s. And then we suspended Somalia because it went into arrears and there were all the conflict and situation there. As of last year, Somalia cleared its arrears with IFAD, with the help of actually IFAD and its member states. And we have resumed with regular financing. So what does this mean? So we start with first an assessment. So we do assess the vulnerabilities and what are the needs, the immediate needs that we need to invest in terms of ensuring food security. So that is paramount in a country like Somalia, which had 5 failed rainy seasons, facing drought and migration conflict, multidimensional, let's say, factors. So we've done an assessment there. and always in partnership with government. So government is central to our investments. Discussing with technical ministries about what their priorities would be, what are the national priorities. And then, of course, we don't do things in isolation, so we work with partners. So we would partner with either the World Bank or with other technical UN agencies, specialized agencies to be able to invest. So we do our assessments, we do our diagnostics, and then we come up with depending on the resources available, we actually cost this financing package, and we develop the investment. So to give you an example, in Somalia, what we have done is we know that we have to address agro-pastoralist issues, because this is a fundamental, let's say, core of Somalia society, and especially in areas where you have, agro-pastoralists, which form quite a large part, but also to ensure that this investment will also help mediate potential conflict, because many of these, nomadic pastoralists and all who move around can also be a source of conflict when you were trying to access limited natural resources. So we worked in terms of so the investment looks at water management, better natural resource management. So trying to address, degraded pastoral lands and rangeland management. We're looking at also, when you have in such places, they're exposed to many types of erosion, like wind erosion. So how do we also support the communities, then access to water, building wells, or actually also creating shallow dams for them. So there's a whole, I would say it's not just an investment in water or this, but it's a multidimensional investment, which is done then together with the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Livestock or a range of ministries. And then the communities play a central part as well, because they're the ones who we have to work with together all the time to ensure the success. And most importantly, the sustainability. So not just the success of the investment, but how to make it more sustainable. And it can only be embedded in communities if they take ownership and they're really involved in the whole sort of development of this program.
And in general, how big is an investment like this? Do you have a sense of its scale?
Yeah, so on average, our investments would be around 25 to 30 million. In the case of Somalia, we actually, because of the importance and strategic importance also of Somalia, the investments are close to even now about $70-80 million. And this is also with other partners. So it's not just IFAD financing alone, but it's also a partnership with others that we have these programs. In other countries, the investment can be over 100 million. In very small countries, the investments can be around 10 million. So this is usually the range of, and we have, similar to the World Bank, what we call a performance-based allocation system. So again, it's also depending on the performance of those countries, and how because our whole objective is to have impact where we go. So if there's impact, then we can invest more, and it can also lead to more partners coming in.
Can I maybe ask a silly question? But having kind of read up on, you mentioned that if IFAD has just obtained a credit rating and started accessing capital markets, your president has a background in the IFC, which is, as we know, the private capital or private investment side of the World Bank. So when you say investment in this context, what do you mean? Is it mostly loan financing? Is it grants? Is it could it be even equity investment into into some part of the agriculture sector? Be very curious to hear how you're thinking about that.
All right. So thanks to the credit rating, we have now a wider range of instruments available to us. So initially, we used to just, IFAD would only provide sovereign loans. With some grants, we had a few mechanisms for grant financing, which were, and of course, to least developed countries, economies, we would give always grant financing. but most of our portfolio used to be in sovereign loans. Now, as of the last 4 years, if I recall correctly, yes, we have actually been financing directly the private sector. So we have what we call non-sovereign operations. So we do have investments, which is equity financing with some of the private sector. And this is expanding. So it's an expanding portfolio. We're also working directly, investing with public development banks. That's another growing portfolio. Fortunately now we have these instruments that allow us to also work more flexibly and to have blended financing for such to address some of the challenges. We also have we've been also working a lot with many of our bilateral donors as well to address certain specific thematic areas. So adaptation has been one of them, where we've received significant financing for adaptation. And we also, we work on nutrition as well. So thanks to many of the donors, we've been also working on nutrition as a specific investment, working also directly with private partners as well in that.
So a very short question. So we've gone down this path of investments. How much do you invest? What tools do you have for investing? But I'm now thinking about the fundraising part and whether or not, given that climate is such a big topic for IFAD, is IFAD involved in the bond markets? Are you guys issuing bonds? What's happening on that side?
Yes. Okay. That's again another new area that has evolved through, in the last few years. So we issued our first bond. That was I think 2 years ago, or last year. It's just everything seems a little blurred when you're starting a new year. So yes, we've issued our first bond, and we also just, I think 2-3 days ago, issued another placement. We had another placement bond with the Swedish, I think it was development, fund or something, and
Swedfund maybe.
Yeah. And then we also had. We had also a placement with Germany, so we've had quite a few recent placement bonds. And one thing we were actually very excited about is that, I don't know if you followed this news, but IFAD was launched its first bond in the London Stock Exchange last year, towards the end of last year. So it's been quite an exciting and, I must say, very dynamic period for us in this space, because we've moved from a very traditional loan financier for agricultural, investments to growing into a full-fledged international financing institution.
And can you just explain a bit for our listeners and watchers, how does issuing the bonds and becoming, all of the things you just described, diversifying your financial portfolio, how does that affect your ability to do better work to help more vulnerable people concretely?
Okay. Well, I'm not the person involved with all the, sort of the technicalities of the financing, but I'll talk to you from the operations, because that's where you've ended your question with. No, definitely, especially working with the private sector, this has really opened up a lot of new areas for us, in the sense that we have more access to resources. We're also able to leverage more participation and actors into the investments that we used to do. So it's now not just traditional donors or traditional investors, but working really with the private sector. That was one area that has really helped us to expand in terms. But another is also the amount of financing that we can also bring forward. As I told you, we used to have allocations for countries, but now that we have more resources, we're able to place bonds in the market. We're able to leverage more. We're able also to outlay more resources to these communities. And as I said, more and more we're seeing more fragility, much more complications and challenges in the agricultural and rural sectors. So it allows us to be more creative as well, because now we can also blend, our climate with our nutrition, with our, youth, objectives, and bring them all together, and we have more resources to address that.
So you mentioned the private sector, and previously you also mentioned technology. And I think something that a thematic area that's grown in recent years within the agriculture space and within the production, particularly within fragile context, is how do we secure more of the value from the crops to the farmers, instead of having kind of the value sit either with aggregators in country or with firms abroad. And here, a key thing is obviously the types of power dynamics that we find in these value chains. And there have been some interesting innovations in terms of using blockchain to track and to kind of try and figure out how to change those dynamics. So we'd be very curious to hear how you and IFAD think about these power dynamics in the different value chains, and how you're working to shift more of the value towards the local producers, which is very much in line with the poverty reduction mandate that you have.
Yeah. So no, thanks. That's an interesting question, because we look at technologies and I would say digitalization of what we call. I mean, I'm sure this term is used by others as well. The ICT for development, so using information, communication, and technologies for development, where we've actually got a strategy now for that in IFAD, but we also recognize that different contexts and different conditions require different solutions. So some of them are very basic. So you have a cell phone, you inform, farmers can be notified about weather information, they can they can call in for advice on extension services. And that's just one basic, I would say, what they call push and plug type of information. The other is much more sophisticated, where we've also helped to set up market platforms. So there's actually where, as you said, where you can help the farmers also bargain for better prices and be more aware about the market dynamics, and be able to have, a platform where they can sell online, or they can actually also secure some of the, the prices, but also contracts, right? So they could have a form of contract farming where they could actually secure their, their incomes ahead of time, and also address some of the climate challenges. The others is also things like precision agriculture, and especially on farming and production, where we have, some also using, equipment that is supportive to farmers to be able to use less water, be better use of fertilizers and other inputs, so that, they're making better value for money, as I would say. Another type of technology also that where we have been also focusing on is GIS mapping. And this has really helped inform us, especially in fragile situations, on how best to intervene. The question from Paul earlier about, how would you do an investment, in a place like Somalia, or even in Yemen and other countries, we would use a lot of GIS mapping to inform us, and to be able to monitor as well the kind of changes that are occurring because of our or other interventions on the ground. So all this can form a package of solutions, but we then tailor them and customize them depending on what conditions are there, and which partners are available to actually support us.
So I initially want to ask you about technology in fragile contexts, because maybe that can overcome some challenges, but I realized we need to talk about fragile contexts first. And I'm curious about IFAD's strategy in fragile contexts. What are your principles for engagement? How do you approach fragile contexts? And what are the differences with non-fragile contexts? So just wanted to get us started on this path.
Right. So, well, IFAD's, looks at fragility as in a multidimensional sense. So we don't just look at fragility as synonymous to conflict. We look at fragility being economic fragility, institutional fragility, social fragility, and it could be a combination of all. We started I always say, again, going back to IFAD was set up to deal with a fragile situation. And so it's part of our DNA to be addressing fragility. And another feature of IFAD is we always work with the most vulnerable and what we call the last mile population. So people in the most remote and most marginalized areas are the ones we work with, who are usually the most fragile. So having said that, it's part of what we do. It's part of our day-to-day fragility, but we've actually been enhancing. Again, part of our evolution was also to draw lessons from our interventions in fragile situations over the years and to see how best we can be more effective and impactful. So we actually, right now, as we speak, are about to launch our enhanced approach to operating in fragile situations. We're not calling them fragile countries because situations is much more precise because, as I said earlier, we work in very remote areas. And we're about to launch that. And our principles of engagement we have 4 principles, and that is building long-term resilience, especially where we're working with rural women, girls, vulnerable groups to be able to reduce their, vulnerability to shocks. Another, second principle is prevention. I think all of us are saying that the cost of investing in recovery and the cost of investing is too much and I think the numbers speak for themselves. For $1 that you invest in prevention, you spend, the jury's out. I know some say $10 in recovery and in emergency, and some say $16. But as you see, it's at least more than 10 times more what you would spend on prevention. And this is also to be able to help to identify and address fragility drivers and be able to address the core roots of some of these issues. The third is do no harm. That's our third principle. Whatever interventions we try to do, as I said, even that's why we're calling it situations, is to prevent those local, potential local drivers of fragility. So again, not talking just conflict, but even within the very local context, we can, if we go in with the principle of do no harm, is to know what's happening locally and then try to also be supportive of the local context. And the fourth was remaining engaged. Now, politics normally plays a lot here in when institutions like ours can remain engaged or not. But we realize, COVID is the most recent example. When there was a shutdown everywhere, IFAD actually reinforced its support. And we didn't have, and we're not an emergency response institution like other UN agencies, but immediately we set up a rural poor stimulus facility, which was done almost overnight. And that was injecting necessary funding, but targeted funding at ensuring input supplies can go in, that we can ensure that communities can receive the fuel that they needed, because, of course, that was another factor, that there was, they were able to actually, rather than go with negative coping mechanisms that selling off their assets, they can actually have the resources and some of the income and bridge that gap. So those are our 4 principles. Now, what are we doing to bolster our, the prevention? As I said earlier, is capacity building, community empowerment, making sure that that we foster the social cohesion and making sure communities are more resilient, so that one small trigger doesn't affect them, and then making also with partners, because this is not our main area of focus, but education, healthcare. Is also something, and providing infrastructure to ensure rural development and that we enhance the stability in these areas. We have identified 8 entry points for us. So of course, we know that not all. I mean, again, when I say 8, it doesn't mean we go with all the 8 at one shot, but we do try to be also effective in terms of, again, addressing proper diagnostics, making sure that we are working in partnerships, that we have, technologies, we're using the technologies, where, we're working also targeting, the targeting matters a lot in these situations. So these are some of the entry points that we are focusing on to be able to have a more effective intervention in fragile situations.
So a quick follow-up on that, because I'd be very curious to learn, how do you strike the balance between crisis response? You mentioned that IFAD was not an emergency organization, like agency, but you just described also a kind of response that IFAD did. So crisis response versus prevention. Because on the one hand, crisis response is very visible. You can always tell your funders, you can always tell your stakeholders, even the people on the ground, here's where we are, here's how we responded. Prevention is a bit more hypothetical. It's trying to mitigate for a future loss or a future negative impact. And do you sense a tension between these two sort of areas, and how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I think our mandate helps us to reconcile that, because we know that we don't react. We're not supposed to be reactive and first responders, let's say, to any crisis. So we know that. But the exception was, of course, the COVID pandemic. That our main intention for intervening at that point was to avoid a slippage and an erosion of the development gains we had made, because the whole objective was to maintain this communities that we had been supporting, so that they don't end up being worse off than where they started. Now, that was the motivation, but in most of the countries, like if I take Yemen, or we're now working in many countries, like even Lebanon. But beyond even the Sahel, so we have a big program with GCF called the SD3C or the SD3C, which is working on basically addressing multifaceted challenges. So it's about resilience building, human building, development strategies, and targeting vulnerable populations. To answer your question more specifically, what we try to do here is that I think we all understand that resilience of communities is core to prevention. I mean, making sure that communities can withstand shocks, communities can be able to bear any situation that occurs. And how do we do that is like our basic intervention always, as I said, was with local communities, working with them on basic infrastructure. So it's infrastructure, it's education, it's making sure they have the minimum input supplies to be able to be self-sufficient. Ultimately, we also have to work in developing institutions that can help them. So it's not about us being there on the ground, but it's actually the institutions that are there on the ground, the community-based institutions that can help them then withstand the shocks and withstand any possible, any crisis that occurs, unpredicted crisis. Now, and IFAD, I think we're very clear on that with ourselves, that whenever there is a crisis situation, as is the case now in Palestine, we had an operation in Palestine in the West Bank, but what we are doing is that we're not rushing in to say, well, we're going to do some quick recovery or this. We're just maintaining the current development intervention investment that we were doing, which is working on orchards, working on this to ensure that the livelihoods are not disrupted. And if they have income, then they'll be able to withstand a lot of the shocks that they're facing now with the current crisis.
So, related to this, want to dig into a little bit on the measurement side, because obviously we're coming now from prevention, which, you know, logically, rationally is one of the best things that the development community has ever really kind of set their eyes on. You know, we can save $10 for each dollar spent. It's excellent. It's wonderful. But then when it comes to actually implementing solutions towards it, generating capital for it, and measuring the outcomes of it, particularly, you know, because the outcomes are often averting a crisis or helping strengthen the resilience, that becomes much more difficult. So perhaps from a starting point from this prevention approach, but also more broadly, how do you think about results and measurement at IFAD?
Okay. Again, you know, we've got a responsibility to ensure that all our interventions have actually an impact, and therefore we have a very robust system here called we have a results measurement framework, and for every investment there are core indicators, and we have what we call we have a sort of develop a theory of change, which is something that we measure. We look at what are the challenges, and within that theory of change, once we look at the challenges and we look at solutions, then we come up with indicators for each and every investment, and those indicators are measured on an annual basis to ensure that we're actually meeting those targets. And we also take corrective measures where we feel that the system, we have M&E monitoring and evaluation systems that are in place in every single project, which are embedded usually in government institutions. And we use that not just for the purpose of us to make reports, because usually that's the tendency, is that the institutions like ours are just using that for report purposes and for resource mobilization. But we actually use that for accountability with government. And as I said, we have this performance-based allocation, so we make sure that governments actually realize that if they're not doing well on the targets that they committed to, then we will also hold them accountable, and that would mean less resources. That's one way. Now the other, we do have these core indicators which we measure. We also look at, we have, of course, impact bonds now. So we're also looking at how we measure, and we've actually been measuring the performance of our investments against each of the SDGs. So we can actually track each of the investments with the SDGs that they're actually expected to achieve, which is really also another good way of seeing whether we are contributing towards these global goals. We also, we use this as annual reporting. We report it, it's in our annual reports, but we also use it internally to measure performance of certain interventions. So, yeah. So we take it very seriously, actually. It's we're all held accountable for results.
So you mentioned Palestine earlier, and it made me think about conflict. And I'm curious, how do you work in situations of conflict? Is IFAD present? Do you have staff? What happens when conflict breaks out in a region where you have staff? How do you take care of your staff? I know there's a lot of questions wrapped into one, but the topic of conflict is a sensitive one for all agencies, and I'm curious how IFAD is approaching it.
Okay, so in some countries like Palestine, we don't have our own staff. So as I said earlier, we usually work through government systems, so government structures and institutions. So in that case, it was working through the Ministry of Agriculture in Ramallah. But I can give you the perfect example, which was Sudan, which caught most of us, by surprise. We had our staff, we had an office based in Khartoum, and overnight we all had to, find measures of protecting. So I think our primary responsibility was the security and safety of our staff. That was the first, let's say, focus was we had staff in the country. How do we protect them? How do we make sure that they're safe and we can ensure their safe exit or safe transfer to safer locations? That was primary, and there was a crisis response team, although, as I said earlier, we're not a crisis organization, but because we're working in very fragile environments, we do have, which is made up of course, several departments in the house: security, finance, administration, operations. So, and once we were able to secure the security of the staff, we quickly moved on then to safeguarding assets. So it was part and parcel of our plan and our strategy. So we're looking at safeguarding assets and making sure that our assets, be it, the personal property of staff or the property of the organization, but also then the investments. So immediately we were working in 11 governorates in Sudan, and we shut down 4 immediately, and we moved away to sit where there was no active conflict. And remember that the onset of this was the beginning of the planting season. So to avert a food crisis in Sudan, which could have also had spillover effects, we immediately made sure that we continued to ensure seeds were distributed, that equipment, services that we were deploying before under normal circumstances were done in these 7 governorates, which we were still operating in, and which we continue actually to do so until today. And we mobilized also with FAO. We worked with other partners so that we could ensure that we can get through the planting season and also secure the a no kind of, let's say, reasonable harvest season for food security purposes.
So I'm curious, how does that look like on the ground? Do you have any examples from a fragile state, from your personal experience, that you can think back at and give us just a real feel for what do those challenges that we've been talking about look like on the ground? What are the challenges those communities are facing? Is there anything surprising that you encountered where your action made a large difference?
Yeah, well, so many examples come to mind. So, yeah, I mean, in many of the countries where we're working, at least in my region, so my region is Middle East, North Africa, but also Europe and Central Asia, which used to be quiet until the Ukraine war, conflict erupted. So, I mean, most of the challenges that the communities are facing in these fragile contexts is access to adequate resources. So if it's financial, but also it's a lot of inputs, and that is affected by the infrastructure. It's affected also by their knowledge of how to make best use of the resources that they get, and the limited resources that they have. Now, the thing that surprised me the most is that we always think that we have all the answers and the solutions, and we come with them. But actually, they're better placed to know the solutions that best work for them. So we're working in Somalia, or working in Sudan, working even in Yemen. We were trying to get, for example, to manage the way the pastoralists and the settled communities can live side by side. And that was a real concern for us, because the pastoralists move up and down, they graze on the land of the settled communities, and there was always, a lot of tensions there building up. So what we were thinking that we could designate areas, we could work with, the leaders of these communities to govern the way they will access the land. And they said, to our surprise, they already had a very customary way of doing this. And all they needed was that our support to be able to build more infrastructure to ensure that the let's say the movements and do not, overburden the existing facilities. So we just helped to build more infrastructure. to fence some of the water points because the livestock were going into where the drinking water supply was, and just some simple infrastructure. But they came up with the solutions and the local solutions themselves, and all we had was the financing and the we didn't have the technology actually came from them. So so that was really I mean, it's not, of course, it's not rocket science, but I think it's we tend to forget that many of these solutions come from the ground and from the grassroots themselves.
Speaking of grassroots, we've been talking about these challenges that kind of are not gendered at this point. Are there gender-specific challenges that you have encountered on the ground? And can you give us some examples?
Yeah, even in normal communities, actually. I mean, not necessarily fragile and vulnerable and remote, but even so. The one that stays with me was many years ago. We arrived in a community somewhere in a very remote area in Sudan, and we were not allowed to meet or interact with any woman in that community. The women were not even, like, there was no register which knew which woman existed in this community. They knew themselves, the community knew it by themselves, but there was no way to document or to give them any, identification or access. They could not access resources by themselves. They could not, there was a very, very customary, traditional way of life that we were not allowed to have any interaction. Even myself as a woman was not allowed to have that conversation with the women because we would somehow pollute the community. And it was just fascinating in many ways, because even when a woman lost her husband, the hut, the doorway to the hut, which used to be into the central, court, would then be changed to face, they would seal the door and make the door face the rest of the, sort of the vast lands, the open lands. And
the backyard.
And backyard, yeah. But it was, you're looking here at communities in very remote areas where there's really nothing happening. So the door of the hut would then be turned to face. And it really struck me, because this was like, it was a non-starter. It was very hard for us to come and start talking about giving women an opportunity to become economically active, to participate. But then eventually we found one of their own, community elders, who was a woman, who we felt would be a nice, sort of like one of our channels to be able to gain the confidence. So because she was elderly, and because she was respected, and because she was seen as sort of the mother of this community, we started, having those small conversations with her. And then it was really left to the Sudanese to speak with the Sudanese. Not us, not anybody else, but really between them. And, and like 5 years when I went back, there was a register and there was identity documents. They were being actually given identity documents, which was the first step. And then, a few years later, we went back and they were doing home processing of, tomatoes. And there was a lot of excitement activities. They were still doing it with women alone, but it was really, really, for me, that always stayed with me, that it can happen. But I just want to emphasize one thing. Development and agriculture development takes time. And community development takes time. So, sometimes we want quick fix solutions. We really need to be patient, because it can take even 20 years before you actually see a change. But those changes, if they're done well, can be lasting changes.
So you've just touched on something that I wanted to sort of to ask you, which is you've given us now a flavor of some of the challenges on the ground. You've told us how when you first visited the village that you were just discussing, you had maybe some ideas in mind about how solutions look like, but then people actually had their own ideas. It turned out that infrastructure was key part of it, and all you had to do is more of a facilitating role. If you think of the people who are very far away from these situations, from countries affected by whether it's conflict, whether it's fragility, whether it's droughts or extreme weather phenomena. What are some of the things that you believe they are missing because of the distance and because of the fact that earlier on you just told us that you grew up on a farm, you had from a very young age, you kind of had an intuitive understanding and real life examples of what that means. So what would be those sort of key elements that we should keep in mind when we think of even advocacy?
Okay, so you take me back now also to my own upbringing a little bit here, because I grew up, I come from a Yemen family at the end of the day, and I grew up with a single mother, and that was unheard of in our society, that a woman who is a single mother, living alone, you never lived alone if you're a single mother, and you, least of all, that you would even start, doing your own business and becoming, your own breadwinner. So, and when I think about just that as a living example of what I grew up with, it helps me to think about what matters most and what we need to keep in mind. Many of these communities are very proud communities. And they're not looking for charity. They're not looking for handouts. Sometimes, and we have seen that even in Sudan, and I use Sudan because I work there quite a bit, but in many of these communities, we have used programs that have actually been creating a dependency culture. And I think we need to step back from that and really use go in understanding that these are communities with a sense of pride, communities that are actually willing to help themselves, but just they could lack the finances, they could lack the technology, they could lack the know-how. And if we help them to just get around those obstacles without just giving the free money because that's usually a quick shot. You give them money, you come back. The first thing they probably do is either get married or marry off their children, or they buy some assets that they don't really need. But if they actually are helped, when they have their challenge and you actually help them then to understand how they can overcome that challenge, I think it would be much more useful for them. So the empowerment of communities is very, very important. Supporting them to recognize that that they can actually find the solutions themselves, and that you could just be a catalyst and you can just help reach those goals. I think would have much more lasting effects. Give you the example of when we used to work in Syria some years ago. We set up what we call the Sanadik. These are like revolving funds, which are community-based revolving funds. What I understand is we set up 160 of these Sanadiks. And many years later, now we've gone back we're not working there, but we've just gone to try and analyze the impact of the conflict. And these Sanadiks are thriving. They have helped to sustain the communities. They've helped to build infrastructure that they didn't have. And they found the solutions themselves, but we just helped to give them the means of setting up this and creating the I would say more the system by which it works. Showed them how it works, and they took it by themselves.
So when we talk about these communities producing food, we talked earlier about the trend of moving kind of back from this largely non-successful attempts at cash cropping, etc. The common theme somehow becomes self-sufficiency. And, with the global geopolitical situation, we're also seeing the theme of self-sufficiency really coming through at all levels. So how do you and IFAD think about agriculture and food self-sufficiency of countries vis-a-vis the need to also trade in these commodities based on where things actually can grow and have the best yields?
Yeah, I think an awakening moment for all of us was a pandemic as well, and realizing how dependent many countries were. And then, of course, came right after that was the Ukraine crisis, and the dependency on cereals and oil. Food, sunflower oil was also quite striking. That many countries actually went from one day to the next with desperate attempts to stock up. So yes, and it's something that we actually have been promoting in IFAD. Sort of looking at, that's why we have a large proportion of our investments on value chains, is making sure that we can build the necessary infrastructure and the whole food systems within a country that helps to increase production, but also profitable businesses, not just on farm, but also the off farm. So it's very important for us that food sovereignty or food self-sufficiency is key to what we all should be doing and making sure that countries, but also we realize that not every country is going to be able to produce for whatever, be it the environmental conditions of climate or topographies or whatever. They will not be able, or even just the population, to feed the population. If you take Egypt, for example, you have over 100 million people. Yes, you can produce, but you know that the arable land is very limited there. So you will always need to depend. And I think that's where it's not going to be just one solution, like, okay, food sovereignty is a solution, but making sure that we also have conducive policies that allow for fair trade, regional trade, looking at, also reducing the costs of some of these supply chains. This has also been impacted and unfortunately even now more so with what's happening in Palestine. But we have to think about, not just, not in a narrow way, but we have to think in a much more broader, holistic way that countries will depend on each other, but will also need to be boosting up their production systems and reducing waste. Waste is a big factor in all of this. If 30% of what is produced in the world is wasted, then you have a serious problem on your hand. I mean, if we can find a way to curb that, and that's part of the food systems dialogue. How do we reduce the wastage that is currently, part of the problem?
So you mentioned trade and the ability to have fair trade, both on global and regional levels. How does IFAD engage in that type of policy dialogue? Perhaps, you mentioned your portfolio in Africa is the majority of your investments are there. So how do you engage both with regional economic communities and maybe even global ones to drive that type of more, fair trade and the ability of farmers to also get values out of what they produce?
So from a more formal, let's say, trade regulatory of negotiations, we don't really get involved in that because it's not our area of specialization. However, what we do is, I think, the most effective way we've been working with this is to link farmers to markets. That's been one of our, be it export markets. So we have, aggregation, working with aggregators to actually make sure that you have quality, then certification to ensure that most of the produce can be exported or can be even sold in regional markets. And also securing, those markets. So, prime example, what we did in some countries, we had, for example, Heinz with tomato producers. So we linked the two to be able to actually make sure that the tomato producers could have secure market, and they had Heinz, which is obviously a global food industry and company, and that has really helped. I mean, PepsiCo is another one with potato farmers. We've been working with also Mars in Indonesia. So there's been a couple of big international, global food companies that we have been linking our farmers to. but also regional markets and working within even, sometimes you just have to start small. A village producing for a regional market, and then those in the in a bigger regional area can produce for the national market, and then it goes from there. So this is how we've contributed actually to promoting trade and ensuring good quality food safety standards are adhered to. Yeah.
So you mentioned the global food systems stocktake that just took place right in Rome, and then you also mentioned waste, which immediately made me think of water and energy, because you cannot have food without the embedded water and the embedded energy. So when we're wasting 30% of the food, we're also wasting the related water and energy. So can you talk a little bit about the nexus, and if IFAD is doing any work around the nexus of water, food, and energy?
So you've come, as they say, you come to roost at home, because actually I can give you a very concrete example. So you may have heard of the nexus of water, food, energy, which is Egypt's country platform called the NOAFI. And here the government it's part of their 2050 climate change strategy. And the government basically challenged itself, but also challenged all international partners to work together in a nexus approach. And in this nexus of water, food, energy, they selected 3 international organizations to lead each of the pillars. So the water pillar, the energy pillar, and the food pillar. And IFAD is actually the lead of the food pillar. EBRD is the lead on the energy pillar, and African Development Bank on the water pillar. This is a program of a 2030 program for 15 billion. And we have identified 9 projects that actually, I would say, a complement or work together in this nexus approach. So whatever we're doing, what African Development Bank is doing in terms of water infrastructure on the macro, so the large scale infrastructure, we're working on the on-farm production and productivity and making sure that that water is not getting wasted, but also then to be able to pump all this and to be able to also, renewable energy and all, that's EBRD is addressing that through putting in solar panels, putting in all these renewable energy technologies in place. So we're working as the 3 leads, but then bringing in all the other partners. Like I said, it's because it's a nexus approach and it's a coordinated approach. We're not just, it's not the 3 leads working, but we have World Bank, we have a European Investment Bank, we have Islamic Development Bank, we have bilateral donors, UN agencies, all coming together and working in this nexus approach, which I think is fantastic. It's a replicable, replicable model that can really bring about a lot of savings. We're still in the early stages. We're still all in design phase. EBRD with the energy has moved, maybe because it's a bit more, it's clear cut. You put in your solar farms and, but we're still getting to the stage where we're going to put all these together on the ground. So, so this is where IFAD has been involved, and now we're getting more countries, particularly in Africa, asking us to replicate this model that on the nexus approach.
So quick follow-up to this. What's the biggest obstacle to this massive coordination among all these organizations, to the complementarity of efforts ultimately? Because what you've described seems a very, very large scale.
So primarily, of course, is getting all the partners to work together, because we each have all institutional, our own institutional, let's say, procedures, obligations. So how do we, work together in harmony? And I think this is where, when the government is on the driving seat, it's very, very important. I mean, Egypt is championing this, and they're coordinating it in terms of ensuring that the partners are working together. Now, eventually, of course, financing, making sure that all the financing comes through, because as you said, is a mega program. Making sure that that we can also, there's also working on the ground with traditional farmers who have been used to producing in a certain way, and changing the mindset and changing farming practices to moving them towards, working in a more efficient. Most of the irrigation there is done as flood irrigation. Now, when you start moving that to modernized irrigation and putting in drip, putting in solar panels when people are used to diesel pumps, it's going to have, it does take a lot more work, a lot more effort, bringing line ministries, because you have to work across several ministries, not just one ministry, bringing all ministries in line so that. But I must say, so far the cooperation and maybe because it's the first time and everybody feels they have a stake and they want to see this work, so we're all rallied behind this nexus approach, because I think there is a lot of buy-in from both internationally but also by the government to see this succeed. So
I'm going to ask you a very, very delicate question. What's the role for, let's say, the not so green technologies like fertilizer in this plan? Is that, because I love hearing moving from flood to drip to, lining irrigation channels. That's fantastic. But I'm curious what's happening especially with the conflict in Ukraine, especially with the prices on the international markets, what's happening on the, let's say, not so green inputs.
Well, the honest answer is we haven't yet reached that stage of considering. However, what I'm seeing also lately, and I just came back from Algeria the other day, and there's a whole uptake of aquaculture and using the byproduct from these fish tanks as form of fertilizer. So. And it was really impressive to see, because it's a youth incubation and youth entrepreneurship program that we are supporting. And a lot of these women and young girls and youth are investing their, in their little home, are doing that. I've seen that in Egypt as well. There's a lot of also aquaculture farms being set up, large ones actually. And again, using a bit of this as a circular economy type of investment. So maybe that could be one of the solutions that eventually, we start looking at more circular economies, and rather than going back to the question of Johan on dependency on sort of self-sufficiency. I wouldn't say food, but just self-sufficiency versus dependence on imports and reliance on. And I think there's also been an overuse of fertilizers. Again, same thing like water. A lot of that has been, there's been a lot of wastage because it's been easily available. And I think all these situations now are causing people to reflect on better use and better utilization.
That's so great to hear. And we're nearing right here at the end of our conversation. I have one last question for you, and I can't help myself, and it's about the future. You told us the story about being raised by a single mother, the fact that she did that at that time period when women's rights, and coming from a region where women's rights were not as, let's say, welcoming of women. What makes you hopeful for the future? Can you leave us with a positive thought about everything we're seeing, everything that's going on in the world? We've talked about a lot of problems, but what makes you hopeful for the future?
The first thing is I'm seeing a new generation of, I have two young, well, they're no longer young adults, let me say that. And when I talk to them and when I listen to them and their ideas and how they look at life and how they look at, the world, gives me actually a lot of hope that that we're the new generation is going to try to recover a lot of some of the man-made issues that we've created in this world. So that's my first. The youth are my hope for the future, and bringing them. And another is agriculture is my hope, because I feel that we are recognizing how important all the issues that we've discussed today, I think, have been really centered around the importance of actually being able to produce more, but also use agriculture as a form of livelihoods, as a business. I think that for me is, if we get that in motion and we actually get more investments into agriculture and get governments to be recognizing the importance of agriculture, I think that is really a huge leap forward and makes me more hopeful. And bringing more awareness to critical actors in development. I think this is another hope that I have, that we're speaking more. The food system stock take was another platform where we were able to really, many people didn't know how much money was there existing in the food industry. And now people know that there's over $10 trillion available that could be invested. How much pharmaceuticals and other sectors are also, having available. So I think if we bring more information out there, then we bring more critical actors into this development space, I think there's a lot more hope. So I remain hopeful, and we'll all play our part to ensure that we move in this direction. That's my personal, let's say, vision.
That's absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much, Dina. I think we could keep talking for hours, but I think we reached the end of our time. And to our audience, thank you for tuning into FROL, the Fragility podcast. We hope you found our conversation interesting and inspirational. We definitely did. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to know more about FROL, about us, please visit our website at f-world.org and follow us on Twitter at FROL Podcast and on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.